Revenge stories that went way too far. We've all felt it, that deep, burning anger when someone crosses a line. Sometimes, all you want is to make them pay. But what happens when that need for justice goes too far? These 5 true-to-life stories show how ordinary people, hurt and betrayed, crossed a line they never thought they would. Not out of evil, but out of pain, pride, and the belief that they were doing the right thing. From a student who destroyed her rival's life, to a father who became the very monster that almost killed his son. These are revenge stories that went way too far, and they'll leave you wondering, is there ever a point where justice stops being justice, and becomes something darker? My hands didn't shake as I switched the vials in Marcus's research kit. The insulin and saline solution looked identical in the dim lab light, clear, sterile, meant to save lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years of medical school had taught me exactly how to help people. It had also taught me exactly how to hurt them. The sweet chemical smell of the lab made my stomach clench. Not guilt, I was past that. This was justice. Marcus had stolen 18 months of my work, presented my breakthrough on glucose metabolism as his own discovery to the department head. While I'd been pulling all-nighters in this very lab, he'd been charm-schmoozing Professor Hendricks over drinks, laying groundwork for theft. Working late again. Marcus's voice made me jump. I turned, forcing my face into the tired smile he'd expect. Just prepping for tomorrow's trial. My voice sounded normal. Good. Marcus grabbed his kit from the counter, fingers brushing mine. You know, Sarah, you're brilliant. Really. But brilliance without strategy is just. He shrugged, that infuriating half-smile playing at his lips. Well, it's what separates the researchers from the published. The condescension in his tone made my chest tight. Tomorrow he'd inject himself with the glucose solution, standard procedure for human trials, something I'd done dozens of times. Except tomorrow, Marcus would be getting saline instead of insulin. His blood sugar would spike dangerously, not enough to kill him, just enough to make him sick, disoriented. Just enough to sabotage his presentation. Strategy, I repeated. Right. After he left, I sat in the empty lab staring at my hands. They still didn't shake. That should have been my first warning. The morning of Marcus's presentation, I positioned myself in the back of the auditorium. Professor Hendricks introduced him with glowing praise, my glowing praise, technically, since it was based on my research. The irony tasted like copper pennies. Marcus looked confident as he began, explaining the methodology I'd developed, the breakthrough I'd discovered. But 20 minutes in, sweat beaded on his forehead. His voice wavered as he stumbled over basic terminology, concepts he should know by heart if he'd actually done the work. The glucose uptake mechanism, he said, then paused, looking confused. The cellular response to. A professor in the front row frowned. Marcus gripped the podium, his face pale and clammy. I felt a surge of vindication. This was perfect. This was. Marcus collapsed. The auditorium erupted. Someone shouted for a doctor, several someones, actually, since half the room had medical training. I watched Professor Hendricks rush to the stage, watched the paramedics arrive, watched Marcus get wheeled out on a stretcher while I stood frozen in the back row. Just sick, I'd planned. Just disoriented enough to fail. I hadn't considered his diabetes medication timing. Hadn't thought about the morning dose he'd probably skipped in his nervousness. The saline hadn't just prevented insulin absorption, it had left him with zero glucose regulation during the most stressful presentation of his career. But he'd stolen my work. He deserved consequences. Marcus spent 3 days in the hospital. When he returned to classes, hollow-eyed and shaky, rumors had already spread. Diabetic episode. Stress-induced. Poor preparation had nearly killed him. I watched him struggle through basic coursework he used to breeze through. The cognitive effects of severe hypoglycemia, I knew from my research. Sometimes permanent. Usually temporary, but the fear lingered. I'd seen it in other patients, the constant anxiety about the next episode, the way it chipped away at confidence. I keep forgetting things, Marcus confessed to me one afternoon in the library. We were lab partners, after all. I was the logical person to confide in. Words, concepts I've known for years. The doctors say it should improve, but it will, I said, my voice gentle. Supportive. These things take time. He nodded gratefully. The gratitude made my stomach twist, but he'd stolen my work. And now Professor Hendricks was reassigning his research projects. The glucose metabolism study, my study, was being transferred to other students. Fair was fair. 3 weeks later, I found myself staying late in the lab again, but not for research. Marcus's medical records were surprisingly easy to access through the hospital system. Student volunteer access was meant for shadowing doctors, not investigating classmates, but the login worked the same. Severe hypoglycemic episode. Underlying diabetes management issues. History of weight. I scrolled through the file, my chest tightening. Marcus had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 17. Started college on scholarship despite the medical costs. His parents worked double shifts to pay for insulin, even with insurance. He'd been managing his condition flawlessly for 6 years until my sabotage. I closed the file, hands finally starting to shake. But he'd stolen my work. The rest didn't matter. Couldn't matter, except now I knew why he'd been so desperate to impress Professor Hendricks. Why getting published wasn't just career advancement but survival. His scholarship depended on maintaining perfect grades and research standing. Without it, he couldn't afford medical school. Without medical school, he couldn't afford insulin on minimum wage jobs. I stared at the computer screen. The reflection looked back at me, hollow-eyed, just like Marcus. I'd won. My research was being recognized, slowly but surely. Other professors were taking notice of my work. But every victory tasted like that sweet chemical lab smell that now made me nauseous. 6 months later, Marcus withdrew from medical school. I heard through the academic gossip network, always reliable, never kind. His cognitive recovery had stalled. The anxiety about future episodes was interfering with patient care rotations. He couldn't handle the stress of surgical training, couldn't trust his mind to stay sharp during emergencies. He was working as a pharmacy technician now. Still connected to medicine, people said, as if that made it better. As if managing other people's medications could replace the dream of healing patients himself. I got my research published 2 months after that. My name in print, my breakthrough officially recognized. Professor Hendricks called it promising work and mentioned me favorably to colleagues at Johns Hopkins. I should have been celebrating. Should have felt vindicated. Instead, I sat in the same lab where I'd switched those vials, staring at my published paper. The glucose metabolism study that had started everything. The work that was supposed to help diabetic patients manage their condition more effectively. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd destroyed a diabetic man's future while researching diabetes treatment. Used my medical knowledge as a weapon while training to be a healer. Marcus had stolen my work, yes. But I'd stolen his entire life. The chemical smell of the lab made my stomach clench again. This time, I knew exactly what it was. Guilt. 2 years later, I graduated summa cum laude from medical school. My research on glucose metabolism had opened doors to competitive residency programs. I matched at a prestigious hospital, exactly as planned. On graduation day, I saw Marcus in the audience. He was there for his younger sister's nursing ceremony, looking proud and healthy. His cognitive function had recovered, mostly. He'd started a nonprofit helping other diabetic students navigate college healthcare systems. Our eyes met across the auditorium. He smiled, not the condescending half-smile from before, but something genuine. Forgiving, even. I didn't smile back. I couldn't. I'd won everything I'd wanted. The research recognition, the medical career, the respect of my professors. Perfect revenge, technically, but victory felt exactly like I'd always feared it would, like saline instead of insulin, clear and sterile and completely useless when you needed it most. That hollow ache in my chest. That was my conscience, finally recovering from its own hypoglycemic episode. The damage might be permanent. Usually temporary, but the fear lingered. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I realized I'd become exactly what I'd accused Marcus of being, someone who took what belonged to others and called it achievement. The only difference was that Marcus had stolen my work. I'd stolen his dreams. And unlike research, dreams didn't regenerate when you provided the right conditions. Some damage couldn't be undone, no matter how precisely you understood the mechanism behind it. Dr. Sarah Chen, published researcher, soon-to-be physician, destroyer of futures, the perfect student. 5 years post-graduation, I established a scholarship fund for diabetic medical students. The Marcus Rivera Memorial Scholarship, I called it, though Marcus was very much alive and working successfully in healthcare advocacy. I never told him about the scholarship's name. Some guilt, I'd learned, wasn't meant to be absolved. It was meant to be carried. I was replanting my tomatoes for the 3rd time when I decided the Morrison kid needed to learn some consequences. Real ones, not the half-hearted. Will talk to him, promises his parents kept making while Tyler kept trampling my garden like it was his personal playground. 43 years I'd been growing things. Started with my mother's herb garden when I was 8, worked my way through agriculture school, spent 2 decades as a county extension agent helping other people grow their dreams. This quarter-acre plot behind my house wasn't just vegetables, it was my life's work compressed into raised beds and trellises. And this 17-year-old punk was destroying it for fun. It's just plants, Jim, his mother Carol had said last week, like I was being unreasonable. Just plants. Like my prize heirloom tomatoes weren't descendants of seeds my grandmother brought from Italy. Like the herb spiral I'd spent 3 years perfecting was just dirt and weeds. This morning's damage was the worst yet. My bean poles knocked over, seedlings uprooted and scattered, my drip irrigation system torn apart. I knelt in the mud, trying to salvage what I could, and that's when I saw Tyler through the fence. 16, maybe 17, watching me with that smirk kids get when they know they've gotten away with something. Problem, Mr. Patterson, he called out, voice dripping with fake concern. I looked at my destroyed garden, then at his satisfied face, and something cold settled in my chest. Something that felt like justice but tasted like metal. No problem at all, Tyler, I said, forcing a smile. No problem at all. I started small. Reasonable. The kind of thing any frustrated neighbor might do. Noise complains to the city about their loud music. Not technically lying, since Tyler did blast hip-hop until midnight most weekends. I documented everything. Times, decibel levels measured with an app on my phone, photos of my bedroom window facing their house. Built a case like I was still working county disputes. The first citation got them a warning. The second cost them $50. By the fourth, Carol Morrison was knocking on my door. Look, Jim, I know Tyler can be challenging. But these complaints are getting expensive. Can't we work something out? I invited her in, made coffee, listened to her explain about the divorce proceedings. How Tyler was acting out because of the stress. How David, her ex, wasn't helping with discipline since he moved out last month. How she was working double shifts at the hospital just to keep up with lawyer fees. I understand, I said, and meant it. Divorce is hard on kids, so you'll ease up on the complaints. I looked out my kitchen window at my garden, at the new seedlings I'd planted yesterday. At Tyler's bedroom window directly overlooking my beds. Of course, I said. As long as Tyler respects my property. She left looking relieved. I felt generous, reasonable. A good neighbor willing to compromise. That lasted exactly 2 days. Tuesday morning, I found my entire herb spiral demolished. Not just damaged, demolished. Someone had taken a bat to it, scattered my carefully arranged stones, uprooted plants I'd been nurturing for years. My grandmother's oregano, varieties you couldn't buy in stores, lying broken in the dirt. This wasn't teenage mischief anymore. This was war. I called the police this time. Officer Martinez was sympathetic but realistic. Without witnesses or video evidence, it's hard to prove who did this. Could have been anyone. Kids from school, random vandals. It's the Morrison boy, I said. You see him do it, who else would? Mr. Patterson, I get it. I really do. But unless you have proof. Right. That afternoon, I drove to the electronics store and bought 4 security cameras. Top of the line, night vision, motion activated. If Tyler wanted to play games, I'd make sure everyone could see the final score. But while I was installing the cameras, another idea started forming. Something more comprehensive. I knew things about the Morrison family that Carol probably wished I didn't. Small town life means thin walls and shared gossip, especially when you've lived somewhere for 4 decades. David Morrison had been cheating for months before Carol found out. Tyler had been caught smoking weed behind the school last spring, charges dropped because it was his first offense. Carol's nursing license had been under review 2 years ago for a medication error, though she'd been cleared. All public record, technically. All true. All perfectly legal to share with the right people. The anonymous tip to Child Protective Services about Tyler's drug use was my first real escalation. I told myself it was justified, the kid was clearly out of control, maybe some intervention would help. CPS showed up on a Thursday afternoon while Carol was at work. Tyler called her, panicked, and she had to leave her shift early to deal with investigators searching their house. They found nothing, of course. I hadn't expected them to. But I'd achieved something more valuable. I'd shown the Morrisons that their secrets weren't as secret as they thought. 2 days later, my cameras caught Tyler approaching my garden fence. But instead of jumping over like usual, he just stood there staring at the cameras, middle finger raised in salute. Then he turned and walked away. Smart kid. Smarter than I'd given him credit for, but not smart enough. The beauty of being a retired county extension agent is that you know everyone. Contractors, city officials, school board members, business owners. People who remember when you helped their father save his farm, or guided their daughter through her 4-H project, or connected them with grants that kept their business afloat. People who owe you favors. It took 3 phone calls to get David Morrison's landscaping company dropped from the city's approved contractor list. A paperwork issue with his licensing, nothing personal. Cost him about $10,000 in lost revenue, but hey, divorce is expensive, and maybe he should have thought about that before cheating on his wife. Carol's hospital shifts started getting cut around the same time. Not my doing directly, but I'd mentioned to Betty Franklin, head of nursing, whose husband I'd helped through a crop disease crisis, that the noise complaints were really affecting my sleep. How hard it was to be understanding when some people didn't seem to appreciate quiet neighborhoods. These young families, Betty had sighed. No consideration. Funny how conversations worked. How casual comments from respected community members carried weight. Tyler's college applications were due in November. I happened to know from town gossip that he was banking on a football scholarship to state, good grades, decent player, but not quite good enough for a full ride without extracurricular character references. I also happened to know that state's admissions board included Tom Richardson, whose family farm I'd saved from bankruptcy 15 years ago with soil restoration advice. Tom always asked about me when he came through town. A quiet word about concerning behavior patterns in my neighborhood. Nothing specific, just concerns about character development in local youth. The kind of thing that might make an admissions officer look twice at marginal applications. Tom was very understanding. Very appreciative of my community insight. Tyler's scholarship fell through in December. Christmas morning, I was drinking coffee and watching snow cover my dormant garden when I saw Carol Morrison loading suitcases into her car. She looked exhausted, older than her 40-something years. Tyler helped carry boxes, moving like he was underwater. They were leaving. Moving in with Carol's sister in the next county, I'd heard. Couldn't afford the house payments without David's contractor income and Carol's full-time hospital wages. Tyler would finish senior year at a new school, no football team, no friends, no college prospects. I should have felt victorious. My garden was safe. My property values were protected. The neighborhood would be quiet again. Instead, I felt hollow. Through my kitchen window, I watched Tyler make one last trip to their car. He stopped at the fence line, looking at my snow-covered beds. For a moment, he looked like what he was, a 17-year-old kid whose world had collapsed around him while he was busy being angry about his parents' divorce. Had he vandalized my garden? Probably. Had he deserved to lose everything? That was a harder question. I thought about the timeline. The garden damage starting right after David moved out. Tyler's grades dropping, his behavior getting worse, his whole family falling apart while I was methodically destroying what was left of their stability. The kid was acting out because his world was chaos. And I'd responded by making it more chaotic. My coffee tasted like ash. 6 months later, I learned that Tyler Morrison had been arrested for shoplifting. Petty stuff, energy drinks and snacks from a convenience store near his new school. First offense in his new county, but his record followed him. The judge wasn't lenient with repeat offenders, even juvenile ones. Carol lost her nursing job 3 months after that. Background checks for healthcare workers were thorough these days, and having a child with a criminal record raised questions about family stability. Never mind that she was a good nurse, that she'd worked double shifts to keep her family afloat, that she'd been dealing with more stress than any person should handle. I heard through the hometown network that Tyler was in juvenile detention now. Something about stealing a car, joyriding, really, the kind of stupid mistake desperate kids make when they've got nothing left to lose. But in his new county, with his record, it wasn't just teenage stupidity anymore. It was a pattern of criminal behavior. David Morrison's landscaping business folded that same month. Turns out losing the city contracts had started a domino effect. Other clients got nervous, payments stopped coming, equipment got repossessed. Last I heard, he was working construction for someone else's company, living in a studio apartment, sending what little he could to Carol for Tyler's legal fees. The Morrison house sold in March. Nice young couple with no kids, very quiet. They planted a small vegetable garden in the backyard, neat rows, proper spacing, the kind of thoughtful design that showed respect for the land. I should have been happy. My neighborhood was peaceful again. Property values were stable. My garden was thriving, producing the best tomatoes I'd grown in years. But every time I looked at those perfect vegetable beds where Tyler used to stand and glare at my cameras, I tasted metal. That cold justice flavor that had sustained me through months of careful destruction. It tasted like victory. It tasted like revenge. It tasted like the exact moment I'd become the kind of person who destroyed a family because a kid had knocked over some plants. Last week, I got a letter forwarded from Carol Morrison's sister. Carol had written it from the county jail, arrested for prescription fraud, trying to get pain medication to trade for money for Tyler's legal fees. Desperate people make desperate choices, the letter said. She didn't blame me, exactly, but she wanted me to know. Tyler was 18 now. Adult court, adult consequences. The car theft charge had been upgraded to felony grand larceny because of his juvenile record. He was looking at real prison time, not the juvenile facility where counseling and rehabilitation were still possible. He was a good kid, Carol's letter said. Before everything fell apart, he was a good kid. He just got lost when the world stopped making sense. I folded the letter and walked out to my garden. My prized tomatoes were heavy on the vine, red and perfect. The herbs were flourishing, including new oregano plants I'd started from seeds, not my grandmother's varieties, those were gone forever, but close enough. Everything was growing beautifully. Exactly as planned. I picked a tomato, bit into it right there in the garden. It should have tasted like victory. Like justice served and order restored. Instead, it tasted like the realization that I'd won a war against a broken 17-year-old boy by destroying his entire family. That I'd used 40 years of community connections and agricultural knowledge to systematically eliminate every chance this kid had at a normal life. Tyler Morrison had knocked down my bean poles and uprooted my seedlings. In response, I'd uprooted his entire existence. The math didn't balance. It never would. I stood in my perfect garden, surrounded by the silence I'd fought so hard to achieve, and finally understood what I'd really accomplished. I'd become the kind of neighbor kids should fear. The kind of adult who mistakes power for justice, who confuses winning with being right. I'd protected my plants by destroying a family. And the saddest part? My garden had never grown better. Maybe it thrived on the guilt I carried to it every morning, the weight of knowing that my beautiful tomatoes were fertilized by the wreckage of other people's dreams. Perfect vegetables. Perfect silence. Perfect revenge. Perfect emptiness. Some victories, I learned too late, aren't worth the cost of winning. I found the first message buried in my DMs on a Tuesday night, 3 months after Robert Henley had destroyed my career recommendation with a single phone call. The sender was anonymous, but the story was devastatingly familiar. Professor Henley offered to help with my graduate school applications if I stayed after rehearsal to discuss my technique. The discussion happened in his office. With the door locked. I was 19. I stared at the message on my laptop screen, my coffee growing cold as the implications sank in. Robert Henley, my mentor, my thesis advisor, the man who'd shaped my understanding of theater for 8 years, was exactly the predator I'd always sensed he might be. Except sensing it and proving it were different things. And I'd just found my proof. The smart thing would have been to take this to the university administration, let proper channels handle it. But proper channels had failed me 3 months ago when Robert blocked my recommendation for the directing fellowship at Yale. Elena lacks the collaborative spirit necessary for professional theater, he told the selection committee. Translation, I'd refused to sleep with him, so he'd made sure I'd never work in serious theater again. But now I had ammunition. Now I could make him pay. I typed back to the anonymous sender, I believe you. And I think there are others. Would you be willing to share your story publicly? The response came an hour later. I've been waiting 6 years for someone to ask. Her name was Jessica Chen, and she was braver than I'd expected. 25 now, working as a marketing coordinator in Portland, but still carrying the weight of what Robert had done to her freshman year. We video called the next evening, and I watched her hands shake as she told me about the private mentoring sessions that became something else entirely. He was so careful about it, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Always made it seem like I was lucky to get his attention. Like refusing would mean I wasn't serious about theater. Did you report it? I tried. Filed a complaint with the student conduct office my sophomore year. But Robert was department chair then, and... She shrugged. Nothing happened. They said it was conflicting accounts and insufficient evidence. What about other students? Did you know of anyone else? Rumors. Whispers. But you know how it is, nobody wants to be the one who brings down the famous professor. I did know. I'd heard those same whispers for years, dismissed them as jealousy or gossip. Robert Henley was a legend, Tony-nominated director, published scholar, the kind of professor who could make careers with a single recommendation. The kind who could destroy them just as easily. What if I told you there might be a way to stop him? I asked. To make sure he never does this to anyone else. Jessica's eyes sharpened. I'm listening. Social media is a beautiful weapon when you know how to use it. I'd learned that lesson the hard way during my own graduate school struggles, watching careers rise and fall based on viral moments and online narratives. The theater community was small, interconnected, and very sensitive to public perception. Robert's reputation was everything to him. His consulting work with major theaters, his book deals, his keynote speaking fees, all depended on his image as a respected mentor and artistic visionary. I was about to turn that image into his prison. The campaign started subtly. I created an anonymous Twitter account, @TheaterTruths, and began sharing general observations about power dynamics in academic theater. Nothing specific at first, just thought-provoking threads about mentorship, consent, and the ways predators use institutional power. When the mentoring happens behind locked doors with students who depend on recommendations for their futures, we should ask, who benefits from that privacy? The tweets got traction. Retweets from theater professionals, graduate students, advocacy groups. I was building an audience, establishing credibility as someone who understood the problems in our industry. While that percolated, I reached out to more of Robert's former students. Jessica helped me identify potential victims from her time in the program, and I crafted careful messages. Sympathetic, understanding, creating safe spaces for people to share their experiences. The stories that came back made my stomach turn. Sarah Martinez, pressured into oral sex during her thesis defense preparation. Graduated with honors but never worked in theater again. David Kim, groped during scene work, then given failing grades when he tried to avoid one-on-one sessions. Rebecca Walsh, coerced into a semester-long relationship that ended when she aged out of Robert's preferred demographic. 7 women and 3 men, spanning 15 years. All with eerily similar stories of manipulation, coercion, and institutional protection. All ready to speak if they knew others would speak with them. The first public accusation went live on a Thursday morning. Jessica's story, posted on @TheaterTruths with her permission, detailed and devastating. Names, dates, specific incidents. The kind of account that couldn't be dismissed as rumors or misunderstandings. Thread, my experience with Professor Robert Henley, and why I'm finally ready to speak. I promoted it carefully, tagged prominent theater journalists, sent it to advocacy organizations, made sure it appeared in the feeds of people who mattered. By noon, it had 300 retweets. By evening, it was trending in theater circles. But I didn't stop there. I'd learned from watching other exposure campaigns that single accusations, no matter how detailed, could be dismissed as isolated incidents or vendetta attacks. You needed a pattern. You needed to make it impossible to ignore. Sarah's story went live Friday morning. David's on Monday. By Wednesday, @TheaterTruths had 20,000 followers and Rebecca Walsh was giving interviews to the American Theater magazine. The university tried to stay ahead of the crisis. They announced an investigation into allegations and placed Robert on administrative leave. But I wasn't interested in their timeline or their damage control. I wanted him destroyed. The beautiful thing about social media justice is how thorough it can be. Robert's Wikipedia page got updated within hours of the first accusation. His IMDb profile filled with comments about the allegations. Google searches for his name returned pages of abuse stories before any of his professional accomplishments. I fed the fire carefully. Leaked his salary information to show how much the university was paying an alleged predator. Found old photos of him with young female students at theater conferences, posted them with context about grooming behaviors. Shared screenshots of his Rate My Professor reviews that, viewed through the new lens, took on sinister undertones. Amazing mentor if you're willing to do anything for your career. One review from 2018 now read like a warning. Every day brought new details, new victims, new evidence of the university's complicity. I'd become a full-time investigative journalist, spending 12 hours a day gathering ammunition and orchestrating its release for maximum impact. The third week, Robert hired a crisis management firm. They tried the usual defenses: character assassination of his accusers, questions about timing and motivation, demands for due process, and presumption of innocence. I systematically destroyed each argument. Posted Jessica's original complaint to the university, showing how they'd ignored reports years ago. Shared Robert's own emails to students, preserved in their inboxes, that demonstrated his pattern of boundary crossing and manipulation. Due process? I tweeted. He had it. for 20 years. Every time the university chose his reputation over student safety, the theater community ate it up. Righteous anger felt good, and Robert made an easy target, powerful, arrogant, exactly the kind of old guard figure that younger professionals wanted to see fall. By month 3, Robert Henley's life was effectively over. The university terminated his employment for cause, voiding his pension and tenure protections. Theater companies canceled his consulting contracts. His publisher dropped his upcoming book on mentorship in the arts. But I wasn't finished. Destroying his career wasn't enough. I wanted him to understand what complete powerlessness felt like. I found his home address and posted it online. Not directly, but through research posts about where predators live among us. Let the internet do what the internet does with that information. His wife left him after someone sent her screenshots of his messages to students over the years. His adult daughter, a theater teacher herself, released a statement condemning abuse in all its forms that carefully avoided mentioning her father by name. When Robert tried to defend himself in a blog post, a rambling, self-pitying manifesto about witch hunts and destroyed lives, I dissected it line by line. Posted it with annotations highlighting every manipulation tactic, every deflection, every attempt to center his own suffering over his victims. The internet fell on him like a pack of wolves. 6 months after my campaign began, Robert Henley was unemployable, unmarriageable, and essentially invisible. He'd moved to a small apartment across the country, worked briefly as a substitute teacher until someone recognized his name, then disappeared entirely from public life. I'd won. Completely, totally, devastatingly. I should have felt triumphant. The problem with total victory is that it leaves you with nothing to fight. For 8 months, destroying Robert had been my full-time job, my consuming passion, my reason for getting up in the morning. When he finally vanished from public life, I found myself staring at my laptop screen with nothing left to destroy. That's when I started really reading the messages that had been piling up in my inbox. Thank you for exposing Robert Henley. He changed my life too, but not the way you think. The sender was Michael Torres, a working director in Chicago. He'd been Robert's student 12 years ago, one of the success stories I'd heard about but never contacted. Robert saved my life, his message continued. I was a mess when I got to grad school, addiction issues, family problems, no confidence in my abilities. He worked with me for 3 years, never gave up on me, helped me get clean and find my voice as an artist. I know what he did to others was wrong, but I closed the laptop, but the message stayed with me. Over the next few days, more started arriving. Students Robert had mentored legitimately, careers he'd fostered, young artists he'd connected with opportunities and scholarships. He was the first professor who believed in my work. His recommendation got me into Yale. He spent his own money to help me attend the Edinburgh Festival. He visited me in the hospital when I had cancer my senior year. For every horror story I'd amplified, there seemed to be 2 stories of genuine mentorship. Students he'd guided without exploitation, careers he'd launched without expecting anything in return, young artists he'd supported through crises and setbacks. The math started eating at me. Yes, Robert was a predator who'd hurt at least 10 people badly enough to speak publicly, probably more who never came forward. But he'd also been a teacher for 30 years, working with hundreds of students. The vast majority of those relationships had been professional, appropriate, even transformative. I'd destroyed all of it. The good mentorship along with the bad. The legitimate legacy along with the criminal behavior. The email from Jessica arrived on a Tuesday, almost a year after our first conversation. I opened it expecting congratulations, maybe plans to celebrate the anniversary of our successful campaign. Instead, I found regret. I've been thinking a lot about what we accomplished, she wrote. And I'm grateful that Robert can't hurt anyone else. But I'm also wondering if we went too far. She'd been following up with some of the other victims, checking on how they were healing. What she found troubled her. Sarah says she feels guilty now, watching his wife's social media posts about their divorce. David wonders if we ruined innocent people's lives. Rebecca asked me if we're any better than him now, using our power to destroy someone who couldn't fight back. I keep thinking about something Robert said in that blog post we tore apart. About how destroying someone's entire life doesn't heal anyone. At the time I thought he was just trying to manipulate us, but maybe he wasn't wrong about everything. I read the email 3 times before I understood what was happening. The victims I'd recruited to destroy Robert were starting to feel like perpetrators themselves. They were questioning whether justice had become vengeance, whether protection had become cruelty. They were wondering if we'd become the monsters. I drove to Robert's old house last week. It's been empty for 8 months, a for sale sign wilting in the front yard. No one wants to buy the predator professor's house, especially at full market value. His neighbors probably know who used to live there. My campaign had been very thorough about making sure everyone knew. Standing in the driveway, I tried to feel satisfied. This was what victory looked like. The bad man gone, the victims vindicated, the community protected. Instead, I felt hollow. Robert Henley was a predator who deserved consequences. But he was also a teacher who genuinely helped hundreds of students, a mentor who'd saved careers and maybe lives, a flawed human being who'd done both great good and terrible harm. I'd made sure only the harm would be remembered. I'd erased 30 years of legitimate mentorship because it complicated the narrative of his destruction. I'd turned nuanced reality into a simple story of villain and victims, because simple stories were easier to weaponize. The 10 people he'd hurt deserved justice. But did the 200 he'd helped legitimately deserve to lose their mentor? Did his wife deserve to lose her marriage? Did his daughter deserve to question everything she'd learned about art and teaching? Did Robert himself deserve to be completely erased, rather than held accountable? I thought about Jessica's email, about the guilt creeping into our victory. We'd used the tools of public humiliation and social destruction to stop a predator. But those same tools had also destroyed everything good he'd ever done, every legitimate relationship he'd built, every positive impact he'd had on the world. Total war leaves no room for proportional justice. I'd set out to stop Robert from hurting more students. Mission accomplished. He'd never teach again, never hold power over young artists again, never have the opportunity to abuse that power. But I'd also ensured he'd never have the opportunity to help anyone again either. Never mentor another struggling student through addiction. Never champion an overlooked talent. Never use his influence for good instead of exploitation. I'd chosen to destroy everything rather than risk allowing anything. And standing in his empty driveway, I finally understood what that choice had cost. Not just Robert's life, though that was ruined beyond repair. Not just his family's stability, though that was shattered. But the possibility that accountability could coexist with redemption. That justice could be healing rather than destructive. That powerful people could be held responsible for their crimes without having their entire existence erased. I'd traded nuance for certainty, complexity for righteousness, rehabilitation for revenge. I'd won completely. And in winning, I'd lost something I couldn't name but desperately missed. The part of me that believed in second chances, in proportional consequences, in the possibility that people could be both terrible and wonderful at the same time. Robert Henley was gone. But so was my faith in justice that didn't require total destruction. Some victories, I learned too late, demand too much of the victor's soul. Even when they're justified, even when they're necessary, even when they're right. They say time heals everything. That's a lie. Because I still remember the exact sound Alex made when I found him in the bathroom, unconscious, his wrists slit, his phone buzzing with unread messages. He was 15. My only son. My everything. And I almost lost him. It started small, mean comments on his posts, inside jokes he wasn't part of, group chats he was purposely excluded from. But like cancer, it spread. The nicknames. The memes with his face. The humiliating deepfakes. And the worst part? It wasn't anonymous trolls, it was his classmates, kids I had driven to sleepovers. Kids I had offered snacks to in our living room. One of them, Marcus, used to call me sir and ask if he could pet our dog. He was the one who posted the nude photo of Alex. A doctored image. Fake. But nobody cared about the truth once it went viral. The school called it cyberbullying. I called it attempted murder. After the hospital visit, after the psychiatric evaluations, after the tears and broken silences, something in me snapped. I'm not a violent man, but I am a man who spent 20 years working as a systems architect for companies these kids couldn't even pronounce. And I knew exactly how to ruin their lives, without ever touching them. I started with Marcus. A quick social engineering trick got me into his email. From there, it was like dominoes, his Google Drive, Snapchat, cloud backups. I found everything. Sexts, conversations mocking teachers, essays plagiarized straight from Reddit. I uploaded it all to his college applications folder. Then I created an anonymous tip and sent it to every university he applied to. He lost all his offers. Then came Maya, the girl who'd made fun of Alex's voice in a TikTok that got 3 million views. She was obsessed with being a beauty influencer. I manipulated metadata on her photos, then had them flagged for violation of platform policy. Her account got banned permanently. Her backup account too. I made sure she'd never get brand deals again. One by one, I dismantled them. Exposed cheating. Fabricated connections to dark web forums. Sent job applications that auto-replied with links to embarrassing photos. Their digital footprints became liabilities. Their reputations, unsalvageable. I didn't do it out of rage. I did it with cold precision. They destroyed my son. I was just returning the favor. Alex recovered, physically, at least. Therapy helped. I saw pieces of him return, like puzzle fragments slowly being slid back into place. He never knew what I did. He still doesn't. He started college 2 years ago. Philosophy major. Gentle soul. Still a bit shy. But alive. Then one night, I got a phone call. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was trembling. Did you hear about Tyler? He killed himself. Tyler. Another one of the kids. The one who made the group chat where they called Alex it. He'd been rejected from every college, fired from every internship, and most recently, exposed for sending inappropriate messages to a girl in his building. Some were real. Some weren't, and I knew exactly where they came from. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in front of my screen, staring at lines of code. Staring at the tools I'd built. Tools meant to protect. To expose. To punish. And then I looked at a photo of Alex on my desk. Smiling. Alive. I wanted to believe I saved him. That maybe I was a father who did what had to be done. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd become the thing I hated most. A ghost behind the screen. An invisible voice that ruined lives. A digital executioner. And for all the justice I thought I served, I still couldn't look at myself in the mirror without wondering if someone else's father was now sitting in a dark room, just like me, staring at an empty chair. I never wanted to be a hero. I just wanted to tell the truth. It started with a memo. One memo buried in a folder labeled non-urgent, Q3. It detailed a routine chemical discharge. Routine, except it wasn't. The levels of benzene were over federal limits by a factor of 10. And it had been going on for months. Quietly. Deliberately, I printed the memo. I took a photo. I stared at it for hours. I had joined Hemley Global with the wide-eyed optimism of a fresh grad. Sustainability department. Good salary. Good mission. At least that's what they sold me. When I brought it to my supervisor, he told me not to worry. When I pushed again, I was told to think of the bigger picture. When I sent the documents to an independent journalist, they fired me the next day. No hearing. No severance. Just silence. Then came the blacklist. For years I couldn't get hired. Friends stopped calling. Recruiters ghosted me. I went from industry panels to pouring lattes at a cafe where no one knew my name. I became that girl who snitched. They were right, in a way. I had snitched, but what else was I supposed to do? Watch them dump poison into a river and pretend it didn't happen? I could have let it go. Moved on. Changed my name, tried to start over. Instead, I built a war room in my apartment. Literally, for 15 years, I made Hemley Global my mission. I tracked their lawsuits. Their lobbying efforts. Their PR campaigns. Their board reshuffles. I learned every executive's weakness, every factory's violation, every shadow deal they made with foreign governments. I built a digital archive. Then I made it public. When that didn't get traction, I built a network, lawyers, scientists, whistleblowers. I leaked data. I fed journalists the pieces they missed. I exposed the shell companies, the tax evasions, the manipulated reports. It started as a whisper. Then came the headlines, the lawsuits, the congressional hearings, and finally, the collapse. The stock crashed 74% in 2 weeks. The CEO, John Calver, was arrested for fraud and obstruction. 6 other execs followed. The government froze assets. Regulators moved in. The EPA began the largest cleanup operation in the state's history. I watched it all from a small hotel room in Michigan, streaming it live with tears in my eyes. I did it. I won. But victories rot when left out too long. A month later, I got an email. Subject: you don't know what you've done. It was from a woman named Carla. Mid-level project manager. She'd worked at Hemley for 22 years. The company had matched her 401k, covered her daughter's surgery, paid her husband's disability benefits. Now it was gone. She wasn't angry. She was broken. Her email was one of thousands. Contractors. Maintenance staff. Janitors. Engineers. Whole towns built around Hemley facilities were now ghost zones. Schools closed. Clinics shuttered. People weren't just out of jobs, they were out of futures. And me, I was on the cover of Time. They called me a crusader, a warrior, a reckoning. But all I could see were kids skipping meals, retirees selling their homes. The town of Brinton, where I once held a protest, now had the highest suicide rate in the state. The rivers were cleaner, but the people, they were drowning. Did I do the right thing? Yes. Would I do it again? I don't know. Because justice is supposed to bring balance, not ruin. And I forgot that when you pull out a weed with roots that deep, you tear up a lot of earth with it. I set out to punish villains, but somewhere along the way, I became blind to everyone else. And now, when people ask me who I am, I don't say, whistleblower. I don't say, hero. I just say, I used to believe in justice. Now I believe in consequences. If this story shook you, just wait. There are countless other revenge stories that went way too far, some even darker, some almost unbelievable. Movie Camera, watch the next one right here on our channel. Because sometimes, the line between justice and destruction is thinner than we think.